Live virtual event with authors Jane Kirkpatrick and Gregory Nokes. I'm James Crossley. I'm the general manager of Madison Books here in Seattle, Washington. We are recording this event, and it will be viewable on the Books in Common Northwest webpage after the event concludes. If you should have to leave early or you want to share it later on with friends, it can also be viewed on our YouTube channel, live and after the fact. We are really thrilled to be here in this virtual space with our partner stores who help us bring these events to you, Paulina Springs Books in Sisters, Oregon, and Country Bookshelf in Bozeman, Montana. Point out a few things about the space we're in. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. That's where you can enter questions that you would like to pose for these authors, which I will help share with them later on in the program. There's also a chat feature. You can just add comments in there as you like along the way. We will, of course, be monitoring that chat, and any offensive comments will be removed, as will the people who made them. We want this to be a safe and inviting space for all. In the chat, also, a very important thing we'll be doing is providing links throughout the evening to a page where you can buy the books that these authors wrote from the bookstores who are bringing this event to you. Oh, look, there's one in the chat right now. So please take advantage of that as the evening progresses. The books are great, the bookstores are great, so you're supporting a lot of great things when you do it. If you have any issues technically, you can rejoin the webinar, close it, click the link again, try to rejoin. If you have any trouble for whatever reason after that, you can hop over to our Books in Common Northwest YouTube channel and view it there if need be. Headphones often fix any audio issues that you might be having as well. With all that boilerplate out of the way, let me tell you a little bit about the people who are here with me today. Jane Kirkpatrick, first of all, is a New York Times best-selling and award-winning author of more than 30 books, including One More River to Cross, Everything She Didn't Say, All Together in One Place, A Light in the Wilderness, The Memory Weaver, and her most recent book, the one we'll probably be talking about most tonight, is called Something Worth Doing, a novel of an early suffragist here in the Northwest. Her works have won the Willa Literary Award, the Carroll Award for Historical Fiction, and the Will Rogers Gold Medallion Award. Jane divides her time between Central Oregon and California with her husband, Jerry, and her Cavalier King Charles Spaniel, Caesar. I think we know who really wears the pants in that household with that name. We also have Gregory Nokes with us, who is the author of 3 nonfiction books, The Troubled Life of Peter Burnett, Oregon Pioneer and First Governor of California, Massacred for Gold, The Chinese in Hell's Canyon, and Breaking Chains, Slavery on Trial in the Oregon Territory. Greg spent more than 40 years in journalism, during which he traveled to more than 50 countries. As a reporter in Washington, D.C. for the Associated Press, he covered the State Department and traveled with several presidents and secretaries of state on foreign trips, retiring in 2003 to embark on a second career as an author and lecturer. He lives with his wife, Candace, in West Lynn, Oregon. And we're going to hear some very interesting things from both of them this evening about the struggle for rights here in the Northwest historically, and how that bears on the continuing rights struggles here in our region today. I think we'll start off with some brief excerpts read by these authors from their work, and then I will disappear and come back later with questions from you guys. But in the meanwhile, Jane, if you're ready, you can take it away.
I'm ready. I am ready.
Thank you.
But first of all, thank you to Paulina Springs and Madison Books and Country Bookshelf for having us be here and for helping us grow new brain cells as we learn new things in this COVID time. So I thought I would just read a short section. It's a part where Abigail Scott Dunaway was an early suffragist. And
pretty good. I was doing a live author broadcast. We've been open here just over a year. Yeah.
Hey, I can hear that. Anyway, she was a remarkable woman, spent her entire life focused on women's rights, and was a wife, a mother, had 5 kids, 6 kids actually, 5 voters, she called them, 5 boys, 1 girl. And she was very focused on the limitations that have been placed on women as a variety of laws that were in place for women, and felt that the way to deal with all of those was to be able to get women the right to vote. And this short section is where she and her husband, she was married to Ben for 45 years. And they've been married probably, 10 years at this point. And it's January 1859, which is when Oregon became a state. And she was hopeful that maybe Oregon would come into the Union with giving women the vote. But she's actually talking with him because she overhears that he is doing some business dealings in the living room, which will impact their lives quite enormously. Jenny listened. She'd been busy stuffing duck feathers for comforters while frying potatoes for their supper. She was as big as a washtub carrying this third child, and her belly bumped against the table, so her back hurt as she stretched to fill the comforter. She wasn't sure how she felt about another child so soon, but Ben wanted a big family. She blew feathers from her nose as she heard Ben say to yet another guest in their living room something about surety. Ben is offering to secure something. When she later recalled this day, it would be with the scent of bacon swirling around the house, children chattering, and her hands inside the softness of feathers while her mind pondered uncertainty. She didn't know well the man who'd be staying for supper. He'd stopped by and talked apple markets with Ben previously, as she remembered. Since the time she hadn't been hospitable to two of Ben's bachelor friends, she rarely said anything about the surprise meals, as she called them, that she had to serve. She peered into the room and saw something legal looking in 3 folds lying on the slab table in front of them. This is not good. She put the feathers aside, sneezed, as she often did around duck feathers, and moved the frying pan off the burner with a scraping sound, then entered the room where Ben watched the children and jawed with Mr. Markham. Yes, that was his name, Bob Markham. What high finance is happening in our living room? She kept her voice light. I heard the word surety. We can't afford a co-signed note, Ben. Like good Oregonians, we look after each other, Ben said. His eyebrow twitched. He was nervous about her interfering. We're helping Bob here make his investment in the field. Don't you like my pun, wife? Ben beamed. Her heart started pounding a little faster. She reached for Willis and plopped him on her hip. He squirmed and her belly got in the way, so she let him down. And how are we helping Bob here become outstanding in his field? She heard the sarcasm in her voice and saw Ben frown. Shouldn't your little lady be protected from thoughts of business and investments? Jenny heard the challenge to Ben's head of household status in those words. I'm signing a note at 2% per month, Abigail. He's called me Abigail. They'll be compounded semi-annually until paid, but Bob can get that loan. He's good for it. You'll manage your money well, won't you, Bob? No question about it. She could feel bile rise beneath the baby she carried. That's a hefty interest rate, Ben. If Bob, she emphasized his name, if Bob fails to pay, we would be ruined meeting that kind of obligation in his stead. Now, Jenny, let's not air our underlings in public. He's offended that I bring up a concern. She was offended that he hadn't. You'll always be protected. Don't you worry now. The reason that's important is because her husband ensured her that she would be protected. But in fact, that was one of the situations of women at that time, is that they were incredibly vulnerable. Women would have to pay the debts of their husbands if they died, or pay the debts of their fathers or brothers if they ran off and didn't meet their obligations. They didn't have ownership of their own earnings. They had to turn it over to their husbands or brothers or fathers. And in this instance, she was going to be liable for this loan, even though she had absolutely nothing to say about the fact that her husband had obligated them for that. So that is that's one of the core pieces of this story, is the impact on the lack of rights that women had and how it affected them as wives and mothers, as sisters, and as daughters. So I'll finish with that and let my buddy proceed with his contributions here.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you to the bookstores for having us this evening, and thank you to the audience for being there. I'm going to read a little bit from my book, Breaking Chains, Slavery on Trial in the Oregon Territory, since this is fairly germane to what's going on in Oregon and around the country these days. dealing with slavery and the discrimination against Blacks that was endemic in the West as well as was in the South and other parts of the country. I'm going to start by reading a little bit from the prologue. That'll give you a flavor of the book. I owe an apology to Billy Taylor. It's not his real name, of course. Too much time has gone by for me to remember that. I believe he came from Virginia, but I'm not sure of that either. It was someplace in the South. Billy had come to Portland to spend a summer with his grandparents. They lived on the corner of Everett and 32nd Avenue, a half block down Everett from where I lived. Billy was a friendly kid, lanky, sandy hair, a big grin, 12 or so, same as me. We became instant friends for a time, not best friends, but friends. However, in the year just ended at Laurelhurst Grade School, I'd been taught a brief history of slavery in the Civil War. An oversimplified narrative I interpreted as follows: North good, South bad, North fighting to free slaves, South fighting to keep slaves. Of course, in my all-white neighborhood in virtually all-white Portland, there was but a single African American in our school. I had no idea how the North treated Blacks. I do recall my sole Black classmate, whom I didn't get to know very well, would occasionally come to school in a sweater with holes in it. A kid who didn't have holes in his sweaters remembers things like that. But back to Billy. For some reason, which I don't recall, another neighborhood chum and I turned on Billy one day, and he became for us a contrived enemy. We used his Southern background as a weapon, accusing him of supporting slavery in the Confederacy. We began calling him a Reb, which wasn't so bad, but the name calling soon got uglier. We taunted him. We refused to play with him. I hate to think we might even have thrown dirt clods at him once. There was one particularly sad afternoon, possibly the last time I saw Billy, when he left us in tears, head down, walking along the street, back toward his grandparents' home with us yelling and laughingly calling names. Kids can be cruel. No news there, but no excuse either. I guess that was one kid who never wanted to return to our city of roses. What I didn't know then, but I know now, is that we in Oregon had no reason to be smug about our attitudes and policies toward African Americans and other minorities. Indeed, our own history is shameful. Witness: many of our early leaders were pro-slavery. Serious debate was given to whether Oregon should become a slave state. There were slaves in Oregon and no one seemed to care much. Most of those who opposed slavery in the early years did so largely for economic reasons. Moral issues were an afterthought. Consider also the great shame of our Black exclusion laws. Bad enough that a Black exclusion law was written into Oregon's Constitution in 1857, worse that it wasn't removed until 1926. Moreover, I faced personal regret on recently learning that a distant ancestor brought a slave to Oregon. A friend of mine who teaches Black studies at Portland State University said we shouldn't necessarily apply today's standards to events of the past. He is correct, of course, but we shouldn't hide our past either. And we have done this in Oregon. Our history books may boast that we had anti-slavery laws on our books from the earliest days of white settlement, but they overlooked that slave owners were initially given 3 years to free their slaves. 3 years. Turn this around and meant that for individual slaves and slaveholders, slavery was lawful for 3 years. Ask any school teacher about our past sympathies and flirtations with slavery. You're likely to get a blank stare. Ask residents of liberal Lane County if they know of the pro-slavery background of one of Oregon's first US senators, Joseph Lane, for whom the county was named in 1851. Few may know that Joseph Lane ran for vice president in 1860 on a secessionist ticket with John Breckinridge of South Carolina against Abraham Lincoln. Who remembers today that members of the Oregon delegation to the 1860 Democratic National Convention walked out in solidarity with delegates from slave states? If I were in school again, I would want to understand the real history of our state, not a sanitized version that misleads us into myths and misplaced self-satisfaction. We can learn from our past, we should. My intention with this book is to penetrate some of the myths we have about our heritage as it relates to slavery and our attitudes toward and treatment of people of color. We were not untainted by everything that slavery represented. Yes, we declared ourselves early on as opposed to slavery, but we also declared ourselves early on as opposed to having African Americans among us. This book will try to explain how these two positions are related and to show that we in the Pacific Northwest were very much a part of that national turmoil and debate over slavery. We had our own flirtation with the dark side of our nation's history. We were part of the problem. Billy, if you ever chance to read this, you will remember the pain I caused on those summer afternoons. Kids don't forget things like that. Thank you. So Jane, we're going to just start the Q&A here on talking about our books.
I guess I wanted to start by saying that I love that book that you wrote. I really feel like that's how history should be written, to be as engaging as it was. When I first read it, I remember saying to my husband, "This is how history should be written." And I really have appreciated the research that you did that unpeeled a lot of Oregon's not very pleasant history. And I think in part that's Abigail's history too, is that she was aware of the discrimination that went on against women in particular. That was her primary focus. But she was also aware of the discrimination against the Chinese. When she got her newspaper, she started a newspaper in 1871 called the New Northwest, which was all about women's rights and the rights of people who she felt were downtrodden and discriminated against. And so she defended the Chinese, she defended African Americans. It took her many years before she actually defended Native Americans. That was one of her downfalls, I believe, is that she never saw the discrimination that went on for Indigenous people. But she used her newspaper to try to bring to people's awareness what the problems were in Oregon or in the Northwest in general. And I think that's part of what I wanted to capture in this story is that a simple housewife, if you will, who had just a very strong passion about a particular subject, was able to speak all around the country. She gave lectures on the rights of women, and even got Susan B. Anthony to come west and camp with them, with her family, at the Oregon State Fair, and travel around and spoke to legislatures. One of the things that interested me is that her campaign, as we look at how people went about trying to make changes, her campaign was, she did not believe in lots of strident marches or going into bars and taking over the saloons and to get their point. She called it the still hunt. And she believed that change would come by individual interaction, by lobbying, basically. And that's how she spent her 40 years. She never participated in parades or banners that were happening in other parts of the country, and even in other sections of the Northwest, because she really felt that women needed to be perceived as still stellar beings, but not so stellar that they couldn't get into the muck of politics, if that's what it was called for.
Interesting. Could you talk for a minute about the rivalry between Abigail and her brother Harvey Scott? What was behind that? Was it pure sibling rivalry, or were they really philosophically opposed to the issue of the women's vote? Was Harvey?
So Harvey was, he would call himself a self-made man. He was a younger brother, and psychologists will tell you that older sisters and younger brothers frequently have a more intense relationship. I keep this in mind because I'm an older sister and I have a younger brother. So, but he was the privileged child. He got educated. She was not allowed to go to school. She maybe had a year or two of formal education, but mostly she had to stay at home and take care of the other kids. There were 12 children in the family, and she was the third oldest. Whereas Harvey was able to go to school. When they came west from Illinois, he put himself through Pacific University, studied, slept in a tent in order to do that, worked in the sawmill, and then, graduated. He was the first graduate of Pacific University in Oregon, and went on to become the head of the library in Portland, and then was hired by the Oregonian and left that job after a few years to become the head of the customs house, again, which offered him greater status and greater contact. And then he came back and took over the Oregonian at that point. And I think, part of it was because Abigail wanted her own newspaper, and now she was in competition with the big Oregonian editor. So there was that ongoing sibling rivalry from when she was very young. But at the same time, he was so influential, and he was influential with the crowd that she needed. I mean, women had to get men to vote. They couldn't vote it in themselves. It wasn't like an initiative petition, So they couldn't even vote on. They couldn't vote on it. It had to be men who referred a petition to the general population, and then only men could vote. Harvey was going to be a critical person in that. He did support her and support the suffrage movement in the 1884, the first campaign, but it lost dramatically, and she had convinced him that it would pass. And I think that was just like the kiss of death then, because it didn't pass, and he was on the wrong side of it. And then ever after that, he never supported it. He wrote before the 1884 event, he wrote a really wonderful editorial about why men shouldn't be afraid of women getting the vote. But then after he lost, all of those arguments went down the bin, and he just felt that women should stay at home and let their husbands make the decisions. So.
It's kind of odd that women technically got the vote in Oregon before men did, although men indeed could vote. But Oregon didn't ratify the 15th Amendment until 1959. When the amendments were passed after the Civil War, the Oregon legislature did not take up the 15th Amendment. And while the amendment went into effect, so men in Oregon could vote, of course, it was technically not approved until 1959, which is another item should be of embarrassment in Oregon's history.
Yeah.
What inspired Abigail Scott Dunaway's commitment on this issue? I did not realize that she was not particularly well educated. Oh, I assume she was self-educated, obviously.
Yeah, she
was, but what brought this commitment of hers to the women's right to vote?
I think she saw that both she and Ben, her husband, believed that the only way that they would ever see a change in other laws that would benefit women, like equal pay, or being able to control their own income and not being held liable when a father died and left a debt. And there were terrible lawsuit situations where there was a woman, for example, that she helped. Her husband had divorced her. She had Abigail had loaned her money so that she could start a boarding house, and she bought furniture with it, and she opened this boarding house, and her ex-husband came back and took everything and resold it. And he said, it all belongs to me. It doesn't matter that we're divorced. This is mine. And so that kind of powerlessness and outrage is partly what drove her, that the only way that would change would be where women could help make the laws. But I think there was also a spiritual component for her in that. She really believed that there was a reason why she had this passion for writing, and this passion for articulating the needs of women. And so I think it was part of a journey in her own life that this is what I was meant here on this earth to do. And it kept her over it helped her keep crawling up the ladder towards sort of a light at the end of at the top of the cellar when she began to struggle with the kinds of challenges that getting the vote for women entailed. So I think that's what drove her. But I'm not sure that that's any different than, I think about Letitia Carson, who is one of the women that was one of the first African-American women to come across on the Oregon Trail. And you wrote about her in your book as well, that the ability to keep going, and despite the challenges that are put before us, the resilience of these people. Yeah, they made mistakes, and they did things that we look back on them at this point and say, well, that wasn't a good idea. But they demonstrate for us, I think, a resilience, a willingness to keep going, to learn from their mistakes, and then to try again. And it took her 40 years, but she did live to see and become the first woman to register to vote in Multnomah County.
A remarkable woman.
Yeah, she was. I think she would have been horrible to live with. I mean, Ben is a saint because she was just so determined, so.
I'd like to say just a word about what's going on in Portland these days and how my book might fits into that context. Oregon's early history was one of great hostility to African Americans. There were those few who did speak out for human rights, but for the most part, it was a very hostile toward African Americans through here. And now there's been a complete reversal of attitudes. We see in Portland streets these days this ugliness that's going on. I don't know how much it has any longer to do with Black rights, but ostensibly that's what it is. I, from time to time, think this must be the mayhem that, people wanting to commit mayhem and cause disturbances in the city, but that's another issue. But there is a commitment on the part of demonstrators for Black rights, and it's such a reversal of the way things were for many years. Portland is one of the whitest cities in America, one of the whitest large cities. Portland has a very small Black population, and yet Portland and Oregon are outspoken on this whole Black rights matter story. I don't know how it resolves or how it's going to end, but it's quite an anomaly compared to the way Oregon's history was in the past.
I remember, I think the Oregon Historical Society had an exhibit that tried to answer the question, why are there so few Black people in Portland or in Oregon? And whereas a lot of people that came across on the Oregon Trail, for example, were advised to go to the Washington Territory, that they would be better received there. And so, yeah, what you're saying is that it's a long, long history of discrimination against people of color, and yet now the voices are louder than they've ever been. I would also add that women got the right to vote in 1912 in Oregon, but it was for white women. It did not include women of color.
Interesting.
So, yeah. Actually, I don't think that happened for Black women across the country until the 1960s with the Voting Rights Act. That's when they were assured of being able to vote, which is pretty horrible when you think about it.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, and I was going to say that was also true for Native Americans who were not perceived as citizens. Even back in the early 1900s, they were all the policies of assimilation and other kinds of very colonizing and discriminatory practices against Native Americans. It was to get them to become citizens so that then they would be acceptable members of the larger society.
During the debate over the 15th Amendment in Congress, was there any discussion at all back in the 1965, 1966, of whether the vote should be extended to women, or were they not considered at all at that point in time?
It's my understanding that there was discussion about that, but it was actually women had actually voted up until I think it was 1808. They had actually voted because of the the constitutional description of citizen, which hadn't said it was either male or female, it was just citizen. And so women did vote. And the story is that at some point, some member of Congress or someone along the way noted that there had been a lot of women that had voted in a district and had voted against him. And so he is the one that then raised the issue about the constitutionality, about whether women could vote or not. And I think when the 15th Amendment came up, there was just, the pressure was just so great to allow Black men to be able to vote, that they felt that they couldn't risk trying to bring women into that category, that the maleness is what would be the stronger argument. And so women wanted to have their case made with the 15th Amendment, but it was denied.
Yeah, the Oregon legislature back in the 1860s refused to take up the 15th Amendment because it did provide Black men the right to vote. And that discrimination was so deep seated in that period that they just wouldn't consider the amendment.
Right.
Is there anybody else out there who has questions for us?
Yeah, we do this in our living room, so we have these conversations.
A lot of group events, right? Well, I'm writing a chapter for another book that's coming out next year that you know about. You've written a chapter for too, called Eminent Oregonians, that Steve Forrester, publisher of the Daily Astorian, is putting together, and Oregon State Press will publish it. But the person I'm writing about is Jesse Applegate. And Jesse Applegate's known in Oregon for something called the Applegate Trail, which is one of the main trails that brought pioneers into Oregon in the early period. But what he's lesser known for is his opposition to slavery. In 1857, when the Oregon was debating its constitution in Salem, the big issue during the constitutional debate was whether Oregon would become a slave state or not. And I write about this in my book, that there was just an awful lot of support for it. And Jesse Applegate was a delegate to the convention. He spoke out forcefully in opposition to slavery and helped to turn the tide against that debate in Congress, in the Oregon Constitutional Convention, that period.
Tell me his wife's name again. Not Charlotte, not Clarissa. I can't remember what it is, but she was absolutely revered in the territory. And Abigail, in some of the documents that I had read about her, she raises her as like this epitome of pioneer womanhood, and that women like her should be allowed to vote. I mean, she used her experience and her compassion and her perseverance as an early pioneer woman. But Abigail, claimed Jesse Applegate's wife as someone that we should look to be the reason why women should have the right to vote.
It was extraordinary how Jesse would go off and take cattle to California and become involved in Oregon politics. And his wife was the one who stayed home and churned the butter and sold the products and kept the farm going. And that wasn't unusual in Oregon in that period. The women really did it.
Right.
The grunt work, as we would say today.
And I would add to that Abigail began traveling around, and she would be gone for 4 to 5 months at a time, working on behalf of women's rights, and then would churn the butter and look after the kids. And they had a Chinese cook, but he was really an early house husband, and I love that. And I don't think she could have done the work that she wanted to do without the support of him. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That leads to one of the questions a little bit that we have here from the audience. Goes to Jane about when were women eligible to run for political office?
So in the early 1890s, they could run for the Board of Education. So that was permitted. There were some laws that allowed them to be educators, because that was one of the few jobs they could have, was teaching. But they really didn't get the vote to vote on anything else until 1912, when they got the right to vote in elections generally.
So they were allowed to both vote for those, vote in those elections and serve in that capacity at that time.
Yes, yeah, yeah. Which, and, you know, and the men would say, what more do you want? I mean, now you can be educators and you can vote for, you know, the superintendent of public instruction, and, you know, what more do you want? You don't need any more. You got everything. We've taken care of everything else.
I had another question here that was posed for Greg, asking about Native Americans and whether they were taken as slaves as well.
They were taken as slaves, and not a lot has been written about this. I do refer to this in my book, Massacred for Gold, the Chinese and, or no, I guess in Breaking Chains, I write a little bit about this. There was a slave trading center in early Oregon City in that period where people could buy Indian slaves, and many of the early settlers did this. They did not make great slaves as they turned. So it turned out that blacks were the preferred slaves for those who had them. And I should say there weren't that many black slaves in Oregon, maybe 50 max. But the Indians themselves did a lot of back and forth of slave trading, capturing members of other tribes and having them be slaves in their own tribes. And there's quite a bit of that went on. But there was a slave trading center, slave trading block, or whatever it was called, in Oregon City, where you could, in very early years, buy an Indian slave. Not much, I might say very little is known about this in Oregon history. One of those things that is really, people don't want to remember, I think, and that's a case with so much of this material.
Yeah. There's a corollary here, sort of from someone else, asking about Pacific Islanders, Hawaiians from the then Sandwich Islands, who were here in the territory back then. Do you know anything about how they were regarded or treated?
They were treated pretty much as semi-slaves. The name given to them at the time was Kanakas, and John McLaughlin of the Hudson's Bay Company employed quite a few of them at Fort Vancouver. And they were not slaves per se, but they did an awful lot of hard work for very little compensation in that period. But no, they were not slaves, nor were they traded as slaves. But
I would add the Astoria expedition that came, not the overland, but, you know, around the Horn. They stopped at the Hawaiian Islands, and there's pretty strong evidence that they basically kidnapped many people from the Hawaiians, from the islands, and brought them to the shores of Oregon. And there was some kind of an interesting reciprocity between Oregon and Hawaii for many years. And I remember when I was looking into going to college in Oregon, and found out that if I was an Oregon resident, I could go to school in Hawaii on as an in-state person, and this was also true if you were Hawaiian. You would go to school in Oregon as an in-state person, and there was a large community in the Roseburg area of former Hawaiian people that went once they were relieved of whatever duty it was. I mean, they may have been paid on the ship, I'm not sure. But they didn't necessarily come of their own free will. That's my understanding.
That's a fascinating story. I feel like there's a book in there somewhere.
There should be a book in there somewhere. Right?
Yes, yes.
There's a question here, well, a statement and a question from another viewer who says that I often feel like the historical figures of Oregon are overlooked on the national scene. Do either of you feel that way? And if so, why do you think that is?
I remember as a kid in the 4th grade hearing that Joseph Lane had run for vice president. I thought that was a pretty big deal. I didn't, somebody from Oregon running for vice president. Only in later years did I learn he was running on a slave state ticket. So it changed my whole view of Joseph Lane. In fact, I'm going to be on a Zoom meeting here in a couple of weeks where we're going to be having a discussion whether we should change the name of Lane County to drop Joseph Lane's name. I don't think that's going to happen, but it should be an interesting discussion. I don't know. I think Oregon politicians have received a lot of attention. Jane might want to weigh in on this, but the Newbergers and the Hatfields and the Packwoods of the world and Joseph Lane, back one of the earliest senators, I think they achieved a fair amount of fame politically. What do you think, Jane?
Well, I don't think women did. I think that, there's very little. I mean, for example, there's a like a compendium of women who were involved in a suffrage unit, and Abigail Scott Dunaway isn't even in there. And yet she ran a women's newspaper, probably less than 1% of the population of women in the country who would have operated a newspaper. And she did it for 17 years and made money at it. And it was all on behalf of women's rights. She wrote 20 novels. She gave probably 1,500 speeches around the country. And she's not even included in the book, about a listing of various kinds of women who did suffrage work. I think in part it's because we're still considered the tributaries. I mean, we're out here, we're still not fully reconciled into the sphere. People came west. I remember someone asking, quoting a story about Thomas Jefferson and asking him why he bought the Louisiana Purchase as a executive under executive order as opposed to waiting for Congress to come back. And he said, well, Napoleon needed money. He was going to sell it to somebody. I wanted to make sure that we got it. And he said, and besides that, as long as you have a frontier, you always have a way of dealing with social problems. And so in some ways, I think that the Manifest Destiny and all these other kinds of focuses of people moving and migrating west, it was a way of dealing with people who were troublesome back in the East. Send them west, let them go and, make and do wonderful new things. And I think that might have been true for women as well, as a place where you could be innovative and inventive, but it didn't necessarily mean that people liked what you did. And so I do think that male politicians have been recognized within Oregon, and in the Northwest in general, in the East, but truly, I don't think women have. I really don't. So I'd say yes, move on.
You've done a wonderful job of restoring Abigail Scott Dunaway into the national debate. She's getting the recognition she deserves, thanks to you. I've read the book, and it's a wonderful book, Jane.
Well, thank you.
Congratulate you.
Actually, in 2016, I think it was, Oregon had a commission to see about replacing the statues who were in Statuary Hall back in Washington, D.C. And I think who's there now, I'm not sure if I think Jacob or Joseph Lane might be one of the ones. And then the other was John McLaughlin. But the two people who were chosen, but nothing has ever happened with them, were Abigail Scott Dunaway and Chief Joseph. And it, so I don't know what happened to that. I need to get a hold of Senator Wyden and see what he knows about what happened to that commission. But I think it'd be wonderful, as we're talking about changing statues in the universe these days, why not put a woman in Washington, D.C. from Oregon? I would love that.
That makes sense. Is there a federal statuary commissioner or someone who's in charge of that?
I don't know. There must be somebody who's in charge of that. But I mean, I didn't even know there was such a thing. But yeah, it's Statuary Hall. And so each state gets to bring 2 statues into that hall. And ours, whoever's been there for eons. So it's time for a change. Yeah.
Yeah. This reminds me of something I heard you say once. And maybe I'll see if I can get you to repeat something like it here. You're a writer of historical fiction, but you said that if you had your druthers, you would probably be a biographer.
Yes.
But you are not.
That's true.
Why is that?
And I couldn't, because I could not find all the information I needed, because women's history, as Virginia Woolf said, women's history must be invented, both uncovered and made up, because so much of women's history is lost. They weren't interviewed as often as men. There weren't articles written about them. I can always find out more about their mothers, their brothers, their fathers, and their sons than I can about the women themselves. Abigail is somewhat of an exception because she was such a prolific writer. And so there's just tons of material about her. And it was more of a sorting down and speculating about how she felt about things, which is sort of the, you know, the mark of fiction as opposed to a nonfiction book. Biography tells you what someone did and when they did it, and fiction allows you to explore why they did it and how they might have felt while they were doing it. So.
Someone mentions in the comments here, speaking of women from the Northwest that we hear about, the only one, anyone who names associated with Oregon is someone we used to call Sacagawea, which I guess is better pronounced Sakakawea.
Yes.
And it's interesting that it's that a non-white person, but someone who didn't get to speak for herself and is very easy to project onto, just some kind of generic nobility, as opposed to a personality in her own right. Right.
And another Native woman is Marie Dorian, who traveled with the Astor expedition that I spent, 3 years of my life writing 3 books about, because she was such a remarkable woman as well. And she was lost. No one knew that she stayed in the Northwest. She came with the Astor expedition until a woman in the 1970s, whose name is escaping me, but she translated all the priest records from the Northwest, from the French into English. And when she did that, Marie Dorian was discovered, and it was realized that she had been here all that time. Not only is there this remarkable story of her saving her children in the Blue Mountains, but even more is that she became the godmother to many, many orphan children in the Northwest, whose parents died from various diseases, both Indian children and non-Indian children. So.
Interesting.
I don't know of any other author who does what Jane does in the West in bringing some of the women who did contribute so much to our early history and bringing them to life through her books. And I think you do just write about the women, as I recall, and they're wonderful stories. Yeah.
Well, there are men in there too, Greg. there are male characters, but yes.
Oh, I love something what you once said, that you don't write about sex. You're
No, I said
people in your book have sex, but you don't want to put it on the pages of the book.
That's right. People they just don't have it where you can see it. And the reason for that is because I made an agreement with my characters when I started to write that I would not reveal any of their personal sexual idiosyncrasies. And then they've agreed never to reveal any of mine. So there you go.
Yeah.
A very sensible plan.
Yeah.
There's another, go ahead, Jane, sorry.
I was just going to say it makes it safe for people to read because they're not going to be surprised by any kind of, gynecological descriptions when they turn the page.
There's a question here, veering away from that, as we have agreed that we should. A question here for Greg about Oregon. Is it true that Oregon was supposed to be a haven for white people and advertised that way?
Yes, Peter Burnett, who led the first major wagon train out to Oregon, spoke early and often that Oregon and the West, not just Oregon, should be an enclave for white people only. He opposed blacks coming to Oregon. He was responsible for the first exclusion law passed in 1844, which was later changed. Oregon had 2 other exclusion laws after that against blacks. In California, he was governor later. He advocated for an exclusion law against Chinese. He said he didn't favor, but he predicted that Indians would be exterminated in a series of wars with the whites, but he thought the West should be an enclave for whites. And of course, there were many people that supported him, but he was kind of the leader of that particular movement. Fortunately, the legislatures of Oregon and California in that period didn't jump out the window with him on that, but it was a strong sentiment in that for that at the time.
Mhm.
Do you think that's a reason why he left Oregon and went to California? Because Oregon wasn't moving in that direction?
He went to California for gold.
Oh,
He joined the gold rush in Oregon,
okay.
in California. But he did enact the first exclusion law against blacks. And so he did succeed in winning legislative support for a law that banned African Americans from coming to Oregon. An anomaly, an important part of that law was it allowed slave owners to bring slaves to Oregon for up to 3 years, after which, at the end of that 3 years, and the slaves would have to leave Oregon or be subject to severe lashing. And the law was known as Peter Burnett's Lash Law. So on one side, it banned African Americans from coming to Oregon. On the other, allowed African Americans to come as slaves for a short period of time. And he tried the same thing in California. It didn't work down there. But he must have been very, very persuasive individual. He probably held more offices and positions in the West than any other early leader. He was the first captain of the first wagon train to come out. He was head of Oregon's first legislative council. He was elected the first governor of California, and he'd only been in California for 8 months and went down there to mine gold. And he served in the California Supreme Court. And those are just the highlights of his career, which rather was bizarre in the extreme. People have kind of forgotten about him. So I did a book about him.
Yeah, it's a great book. It's a great book.
There's one more question here for Jane, asking about how Abigail was received in her community, given her stance on equality, as well as being a woman in business. As I could see how there would be a fair amount of pushback.
There was a fair amount of pushback. She started being vocal by, she had a little column called The Farmer's Wife in one of the agricultural papers, the Argus. And it was funny, and she talked a lot about issues between she and the farmer, which was her husband then. And she sort of got into that phase of being more strident because Ben supported that. And so the larger community felt like, well, if he was willing to put up with it, then maybe she was okay. It was really important to her that her reputation as a good wife and mother was not stained. And one of the things that there was an occasion in which she was accused of all kinds of, tomfoolery and trickery, and her sons were so horrified they came out and caned the editor for speaking such things about her, because the editor had put it in the paper. And Harvey, actually her brother from the Oregonian, came out and wrote an editorial about what an incredible wife and mother she was, and there was just this was just nonsense. This reputation that was people trying to bring down her reputation. But she was not always welcome in the churches, because most of the churches did not support women getting the right to vote. She was quite adamant. She would go to events. There would be various meetings that were only men only, but she would go, and sometimes 3 or other women would go with her. Often their husbands would go as well, so that they were respectable, and they would just make people uncomfortable because they were there. And in churches, she would actually found some ways to sort of get her point across, because they would ask her to leave, and she would, on more than one occasion, as they were getting her to leave, she would say, "Let us pray." And everyone would bow their heads. And then she would give, a 45-minute treatise as a prayer on, the suffering of women and children, and why these changes need to be made. And so she was incredibly gifted. She could speak for an hour and a half without notes, and quote scripture, and win over many people. There were actually several people in the Portland area who were supportive of her. Actually, the Elliott Center, which is a chapel in the Unitarian Church in downtown Portland, is named for a pastor of that church, and that's one of the pastors who accepted her and supported her efforts and her work. So she had her defamers and she had her supporters.
And now, more than 100 years later, on the 100th anniversary of women nationwide getting the right to vote, we have a public political figure also named Abigail, I think, who's calling for women not to be able to vote. This head of household voting idea that.
Oh, yes, yes, I have heard. I had not heard about that before the Republican convention, actually. So, yeah, it's not. It certainly Abigail would be would take issue with that particular point. Absolutely, yeah.
You're bringing back the wrong kinds of classics.
Exactly.
I have a question for both of you about what we might see next. What are your projects? What are we going to see in the future?
Well, both of us have this book of Eminent Oregonians that'll be out next spring. And then I just turned in my next novel, which is based on the life of Natalie Curtis, who was a classically trained pianist and singer from New York in the early 1800s or late 1800s, and who had a mental collapse in 1897. And her brother, who lures her west and brings her out here, and she becomes healed in her journey through the capturing and preservation of Native American music and art, and worked with Roosevelt actually to try to eliminate the code of offenses, and which were these horrible assimilation laws that prohibited Indian people from singing, dancing, you know, forced them to have their hair cut, all kinds of things that violated their cultural norms. And I heard about her a number of years ago, and I was just taken with how something that had brought her down in some ways as this classical pianist and music ultimately brought her back, and it was the music of Indian people. So that's coming out. Working title is The Musical Healing of Natalie Curtis, but who knows what the editors will decide the title of that book should be, but I'll let you know when I know it.
Sounds good. I'm not as prolific a writer as Jane. I congratulate her on her many, many good books that she's written. I've contributed this piece to the Eminent Oregonians on Jesse Applegate. And for the moment, that's it. Maybe something else will occur to me along the way, but that's it for now.
Well, you both have plenty of good books out there, which is a good segue to remind everybody watching that in the chat, there's the link. Please go to it, find the logo of your favorite local bookstore, and buy a book or two from one of these great authors. It helps them out, it helps us out. We really appreciate it. Speaking also of things coming next, we of course are continuing our Books in Common series with authors. Next week, we have writing teacher and grammarian Geraldine Woods. We have writers for young people, Roseanne Perry and Janet Fox. Later in the month, we have Chuck Palahniuk, all kinds of great authors coming. So we hope you join us for those events as you did for this one tonight. And so we'll say nothing more than thank you both so much for being here. We really enjoyed it. I'm so grateful that you could be with us tonight.
Well, James, thank you so much for doing this. It's wonderful you're having these sort of events to tell people about books in this time when it's not so easy maybe to find them.
Oh, it's great. Thanks for joining me. It was really good to see you again too. So thanks, James. And
yeah, see you guys again. So long.
All right. Bye-bye.